Howdy. Good evening. So I've not publicized what the plan is for tonight because I really wasn't sure until a few minutes ago. But I've got some great collections to play with, including the Weird from the Vandermeers a few years ago. Compendium of Strange and Dark Tales. Couple that I enjoyed, short ones in rapid succession here. We have White Rabbits by Leonora Carrington. Leonora Carrington, 1917 to 2011, was a famous English-born surrealist painter and writer who lived in Mexico for most of her life. From a very young age, Leonora Carrington has said, "I used to have very strange experiences with all sorts of ghosts and visions." Although her art has overshadowed her fiction, Carrington's odd stories have been important to many writers, including Angela Carter. Collections include The Seventh Horse and The Oval Lady. Her stories and the novel The Hearing Trumpet provide a tantalizing glimpse of ways that surrealism might have had more influence on the weird tale. A strong synergy exists between her work and stories herein by Mervyn Peake, William Sansom, and Mercedes Rodoreda, among others. All right, this is White Rabbits by Leonora Carrington. The time has come that I must tell the events which began in 40 Pest Street. The houses, which were reddish-black, looked as if they had issued mysteriously from the fire of London. The house in front of my window, covered with an occasional wisp of creeper, was as black and empty-looking as any plague-ridden residence subsequently licked by flames and smoke. This is not the way that I had imagined New York. It was so hot that I got palpitations when I ventured out into the streets, so I sat and considered the house opposite and occasionally bathed my sweating face. The light was never very strong in Pest Street. There was always a reminiscence of smoke, which made visibility troubled and hazy. Still, it was possible to study the house opposite carefully, even precisely. Besides, my eyes have always been excellent. I spent several days watching for some sort of movement opposite, but there was none, and I finally took to undressing quite freely before my open window and doing my breathing exercises optimistically in the thick Pest Street air. This must have made my lungs as black as the houses. One afternoon, I washed my hair and sat out on the diminutive stone crescent which served as a balcony to dry it. I hung my head between my knees and watched a bluebottle suck the dry corpse of a spider between my feet. I looked up through my long hair and saw something black in the sky, ominously quiet for an aeroplane. Parting my hair, I was in time to see a large raven alight on the balcony of the house opposite. It sat on the balustrade and seemed to peer into the empty window. Then it poked its head under its wing, apparently searching for lice. A few minutes later, I was not unduly surprised to see the double windows open and admit a woman onto the balcony. She carried a large dish full of bones, which she emptied onto the floor. With a short, appreciative squeak, the raven hopped down and poked about amongst its unpleasant repast. The woman, who had very long black hair, used her hair to wipe out the dish. Then she looked straight at me and smiled in a friendly fashion. I smiled back and waved a towel. This served to encourage her, for she tossed her head coquettishly and gave me a very elegant salute after the fashion of a queen. "Do you happen to have any bad meat over there that you don't need?" she called. "Any what?" I called back, wondering if my ears had deceived me. "Any stinking meat, decomposed flesh meat." "Not at the moment," I replied, wondering if she was trying to be funny. "Won't you have any towards the end of the week? If so, I would be very grateful if you would bring it over." Then she stepped back into the empty window and disappeared. The raven flew away. My curiosity about the house and its occupant prompted me to buy a large lump of meat the following day. I set it on the balcony on a bit of newspaper and awaited developments. In a comparatively short time, the smell was so strong that I was obliged to pursue my daily activities with a strong paperclip on the end of my nose. Occasionally, I descended into the street to breathe. Towards Thursday evening, I noticed that the meat was turning color, so waving aside a flight of rancorous bluebottles, I scooped it into my sponge bag and set out for the house opposite. I noticed, descending the stairs, that the landlady seemed to avoid me. It took me some time to find the front door of the house opposite. It turned out to be hidden under a cascade of something, giving the impression that nobody had been either in or out of this house in years. The bell was of the old-fashioned kind that you pull, and when I pulled it rather harder than I intended, it came right off in my hand. I gave the door an angry push, and it caved inwards, admitting a ghastly smell of putrid meat. The hall, which was almost dark, seemed to be carved woodwork. The woman herself came rustling down the stairs, carrying a torch. "How do you do? How do you do?" she murmured ceremoniously, and I was surprised to notice that she wore an ancient, beautiful dress of green silk. But as she approached me, I saw that her skin was dead white and glittered as if speckled with thousands of minute stars. "Isn't that kind of you?" she went on, taking my arm with her sparkling hand. "Won't my poor little rabbits be pleased?" We mounted the stairs, and my companion walked so carefully that I thought she was frightened. The top flight of the stairs opened into a boudoir, decorated with dark Baroque furniture and red plush. The floor was littered with gnawed bones and animal skulls. "It is so seldom that we get a visit," the woman smiled, "so they all scatter off into their little corners." She uttered a low, sweet whistle, and transfixed, I saw about 100 snow-white rabbits emerge cautiously from every nook, their large pink eyes fixed unblinkingly upon the woman. Come, pretty ones, she cooed, diving her hand into my sponge bag and pulling out a handful of rotting meat. With a sensation of deep disgust, I backed into a corner and saw her throw the carrion amongst the rabbits, who fought like wolves for the meat. "One becomes very fond of them," the woman went on. "They each have their own little ways. You would be surprised how very individual rabbits are." The rabbits in question were tearing at the meat with their sharp buck teeth. "We eat them, of course, occasionally. My husband makes a very tasty stew every Saturday night." Then a movement in the corner caught my attention, and I realized that there was a third person in the room. As the woman's torchlight touched his face, I saw he had identical glittering skin like tinsel on a Christmas tree. He was dressed in a red gown and sat very rigidly with his profile turned towards us. He seemed to be unconscious of our presence or of that of a large white buck rabbit which sat and masticated on a chunk of meat on his knee. The woman followed my gaze and chuckled. "That is my husband. The boys used to call him Lazarus." At the sound of this familiar name, he turned his face towards us, and I saw that he wore a bandage over his eyes. "Ethel?" he inquired in a rather thin voice. I won't have any visitors here. You know quite well that I have strictly forbidden it." "Now, Laz, don't start carrying on." Her voice was plaintive. "You can't grudge me a little bit of company. It's 20-odd years since I've seen a new face. Besides, she's brought meat for the rabbits." She turned and beckoned me to her side. "You want to stay with us, do you not, my dear?" I was suddenly clutched by fear, and I wanted to get out and away from these terrible silver people and the white carnivorous rabbits. "I think I must be going. It's supper time." The man on the chair gave a shrill peal of laughter, terrifying the rabbit on his knee, which sprang to the floor and disappeared. The woman thrust her face so near to mine that her sickly breath seemed to anesthetize me. "Do you not want to stay and become like us? In 7 years your skin will be like stars. In 7 years you will have the holy disease of the Bible, leprosy." I stumbled and ran, choking with terror. Some unholy curiosity made me look over my shoulder as I reached the front door, and I saw her waving her hand over the banister, and as she waved it, her fingers fell off and dropped to the ground like shooting stars. Donald A. Wollheim, 1914 to 1990, was an American science fiction writer as well as an influential editor and publisher. Eventually inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Wollheim edited the first science fiction reprint anthology, The Pocket Book of Science Fiction, 1943, and the first collection of science fiction novels, The Portable Novels of Science, 1945. A long-time influence on U.S. science fiction fandom, Wollheim also founded the first major publishing house devoted to science fiction and fantasy, DAW Books, which is now run by his daughter. The Weird Tale Mimic has been widely reprinted and was made into a feature film in 1997. It evokes other stories in this volume by Stephen Utley and William Gibson and John Shirley. Mimic, Donald A. Wollheim. It is less than 500 years since an entire half of the world was discovered. It is less than 200 years since the discovery of the last continent. The sciences of chemistry and physics go back scarcely 1 century. The science of aviation goes back 40 years. The science of atomics is being born. And yet we think we know a lot. We know little or nothing. Some of the most startling things are unknown to us. When they are discovered, they may shock us to the bone. We search for secrets in the far islands of the Pacific and among the ice fields of the frozen north, while under our very noses, rubbing shoulders with us every day, there may walk the undiscovered. It is a curious fact of nature that that which is in plain view is oft best hidden. I've always known of the man in the black cloak. Since I was a child, he has always lived on my street, and his eccentricities are so familiar that they go unmentioned except among the casual visitor. Here, in the heart of the largest city in the world, in swarming New York, the eccentric and the odd may flourish unhindered. As children, we had hilarious fun jeering at the man in black when he displayed his fear of women. We watched in our evil, childish way for those moments. We tried to get him to show anger. But he ignored us completely, and soon we paid him no further heed, even as our parents did. We saw him only twice a day, once in the early morning, when we would see his 6-foot figure come out of the grimy, dark hallway of the tenement at the end of the street and stride down toward the elevated to work. Again, when he came back at night. He was always dressed in a long black cloak that came to his ankles, and he wore a wide-brimmed black hat down far over his face. He was a sight from some weird story out of the old lands, but he harmed nobody and paid attention to nobody. Nobody except perhaps women. When a woman crossed his path, he would stop in his stride and come to a dead halt. We could see that he closed his eyes until she had passed. Then he would snap those wide, watery blue eyes open and march on as if nothing had happened. He was never known to speak to a woman. He would buy some groceries maybe once a week at Antonio's, but only when there were no other patrons there. Antonio said once that he never talked. He just pointed at things he wanted and paid for them in bills that he pulled out of a pocket somewhere under his cloak. Antonio did not like him, but he never had any trouble from him either. Now that I think of it, nobody ever had any trouble with him. We got used to him. We grew up on the street. We saw him occasionally when he came home and went back into the dark hallway of the house he lived in. He never had visitors. He never spoke to anyone, and he had once built something in his room out of metal. He had once, years ago, hauled up some long, flat metal sheets of tin or iron, and they had heard a lot of hammering and banging in his room for several days. But that had stopped, and that was all there was to that story. Where he worked, I don't know, and never found out. He had money, for he was reputed to pay his rent regularly when the janitor asked for it. Well, people like that inhabit big cities, and nobody knows the story of their lives until they're all over, or until something strange happens. I grew up, I went to college, I studied. Finally, I got a job assisting a museum curator. I spent my days mounting beetles and classifying exhibits of stuffed animals and preserved plants, and hundreds of insects from all over. Nature is a strange thing, I learned. You learn that very clearly when you work in a museum. you realize how nature uses the art of camouflage. There are twig insects that look exactly like a leaf or a branch of a tree. Exactly. Nature is strange and perfect that way. There is a moth in Central America that looks like a wasp. It even has a fake stinger made of hair, which it twists and curls just like a wasp's stinger. It has the same colorings, and even though its body is soft and not armored like a wasp's, it is colored to appear shiny and armored. It even flies in the daytime when wasps do, and not at night like all other moths. It moves like a wasp. It knows somehow that it is helpless and that it can survive only by pretending to be as deadly to other insects as wasps are. I learned about army ants and their strange imitators. Army ants travel in huge columns of thousands and hundreds of thousands. They move along in a flowing stream several yards across, and they eat everything in their path. Everything in the jungle is afraid of them. Wasps, bees, snakes, other ants, birds, lizards, beetles, even men run away or get eaten. But in the midst of the army ants, there also travel many other creatures that aren't ants at all, and that the army ants would kill if they knew of them. But they don't know of them because these other creatures are disguised. Some of them are beetles that look like ants. They have false markings like ant thoraxes, and they run along in imitation of ant speed. There is even one that is so long it is marked like 3 ants in single file. It moves so fast that the real ants never give it a second glance. There are weak caterpillars that look like big armored beetles. There are all sorts of things that look like dangerous animals. Animals that are the killers and superior fighters of their groups have no enemies. The army ants and the wasps, the sharks, the hawk, and the felines. So there are a host of weak things that try to hide among them, to mimic them. And man is the greatest killer, the greatest hunter of them all. The whole world of nature knows man for the irresistible master, the roar of his gun, the cunning of his trap, the strength and agility of his arm place all else beneath him. Should man then be treated by nature differently from the other dominants, the army ants and the wasps? It was, as often happens to be the case, sheer luck that I happened to be on the street at the dawning hour when the janitor came running out of the tenement on my street shouting for help. I had been working all night mounting new exhibits. The policeman on the beat and I were the only people besides the janitor to see the thing that we found in the 2 dingy rooms occupied by the stranger of the black cloak. The janitor explained, as the officer and I dashed up the narrow, rickety stairs, that he had been awakened by the sound of heavy thuds and shrill screams in the stranger's rooms. He had gone out in the hallway to listen. When he got there, the place was silent. A faint light shone from under the doorway. The policeman knocked. There was no answer. He put his ear to the door, and so did I. We heard a faint rustling, a continuous slow rustling as of a breeze blowing paper. The cop knocked again, but there was still no response. Then together we threw our weight at the door. 2 hard blows and the rotten old lock gave way. We burst in. The room was filthy, the floor covered with scraps of torn paper, bits of detritus and garbage. The room was unfurnished, which I thought was odd. In the corner there stood a metal box about 4 feet square. A tight box held together with screws and ropes. It had a lid, opening at the top, which was down and fastened with a sort of wax seal. The stranger of the black cloak lay in the middle of the floor, dead. He was still wearing the cloak. The big slouch hat was lying on the floor some distance away. From the inside of the box, the faint rustling was coming. We turned over the stranger, took the cloak off. For several instants, we saw nothing amiss, and then gradually, horribly, we became aware of some things that were wrong. His hair was short and curly brown. It stood straight up in its inch-long length. His eyes were open and staring. I noticed first that he had no eyebrows, only a curious dark line in the flesh over each eye. It was then I realized he had no nose, but no one had ever noticed that before. His skin was oddly mottled. Where the nose should have been, there were dark shadowings that made the appearance of a nose if you only just glanced at him, like the work of a skillful artist in a painting. His mouth was as it should be and slightly open, but he had no teeth. His head perched upon a thin neck. The suit was not a suit. It was part of him. It was his body. What we thought was a coat was a huge black wing sheath like a beetle has. He had a thorax like an insect, only the wing sheath covered it and you couldn't notice it when he wore the cloak. The body bulged out below, tapering off into the two long, thin hind legs. His arms came out from under the top of the coat. He had a tiny secondary pair of arms folded tightly across his chest. There was a sharp, round hole newly pierced in his chest just above the arms, still oozing a watery liquid. The janitor fled, gibbering. The officer was pale, but standing by his duty. I heard him muttering under his breath an endless stream of Hail Marys over and over again. The lower thorax, the abdomen, was very long and insect-like. It was crumpled up now like the wreckage of an airplane fuselage. I recalled the appearance of a female wasp that had just laid eggs. Her thorax had had that empty appearance. The sight was a shock such as leaves one in full control. The mind rejects it, and it is only in afterthought that one can feel the dim shudder of horror. The rustling was still coming from the box. I mentioned to the white-faced cop, and we went over and stood before it. He took the nightstick and knocked away the waxen seal. Then we heaved and pulled the lid open. A wave of noxious vapor assailed us. We staggered back as suddenly a stream of flying things shot out of the huge iron container. The window was open, and straight out into the first glow of dawn they flew. There must have been dozens of them. They were about 2 or 3 inches long, and they flew on wide, gauzy beetle wings. They looked like little men, strangely terrifying as they flew, clad in their black suits with their expressionless faces and their dots of watery blue eyes, and they flew out on transparent wings that came from under their black beetle coats. I ran to the window, fascinated, almost hypnotized. The horror of it had not reached my mind at once. Afterward, I have had spasms of numbing terror as my mind tries to put the things together. The whole business was so utterly unexpected. We knew of army ants and their imitators, yet it never occurred to us that we too were army ants of a sort. We knew of stick insects, and it never occurred to us that there might be others that disguised themselves to fool not other animals, but the supreme animal himself, a man. We found some bones in the bottom of that iron case afterwards, but we couldn't identify them. Perhaps we did not try very hard. They might have been human. I suppose the stranger of the black coat did not fear women so much as it distrusted them. Women notice men, perhaps, more closely than other men do. Women might become suspicious sooner of the inhumanity, the deception. And then there might perhaps have been some touch of indistinctive feminine jealousy. The stranger was disguised as a man, but its sex was surely female. The things in the box were its young. But it is the other thing I saw when I ran to the window that has shaken me the most. The policeman did not see it. Nobody else saw it but me, and I only for an instant. Nature practices deceptions in every angle. Evolution will create a being for any niche that can be found, no matter how unlikely. When I went to the window, I saw the small cloud of flying things rising up into the sky and sailing away into the purple distance. The dawn was breaking, and the first rays of the sun were just striking over the housetops. Shaken, I looked away from that 4th-floor tenement room, over the roofs of lower buildings. Chimneys and walls and empty clotheslines made the scenery over which the tiny mass of horror passed. And then I saw a chimney, not 30 feet away on the next roof. It was squat and of red brick and had 2 black pipe ends flush with its top. I saw it suddenly vibrate oddly, and I saw its red brick surface seem to peel away and the black pipe openings turn suddenly white. I saw two big eyes staring into the sky. A great bat-winged thing detached itself silently from the surface of the real chimney and darted after the cloud of flying things. I watched until all had lost themselves in the sky. Thank you for joining me for a bit of miscellaneous weird tonight. As I said the other night, I am considering the possibility of reading The Great God Pan or The King in Yellow in their entirety, being in the public domain. But this is it for tonight. Hope you've enjoyed the two shorter works. Nice to see you. Be good to one another.